Greetings and welcome to Real Time for our librarian support website. We have a real treat for you today, but we'll get to that in a moment. I just want to let people know that coming up on Thursday, we're going to hear from Valerie Bird-Fort, who's going to be talking about everything around children's literature, keeping students engaged, and story time. So talking about youth librarianship, school librarianship, just does some amazing work as the library goddess. Next week, we've got Stuart Hamilton from Naples talking about the head of library development in Ireland. And Chad Barron will be joining us to talk about virtual reality, extended reality, and such that you can use within your library next week as well. As always, these are being recorded. And so we will not only be putting up the recording of this session, but Dr. Gavigan has provided us with a huge wealth of resources. So you'll also have pointers there and a copy of slides and materials used as well. With that, I want to jump to talking to one of my favorite people in the whole world, Karen Gavigan.
Ditto.
Dr. Gavigan. I said this with Clayton Copeland, and I'll say it again. One of my great pleasures of coming down to work at the University of South Carolina 4 years ago was the people I got to work with, and I have to say that Karen knocks me out, not only because of her great work, but also because of her great humor and frightening amount of humility that we've been trying to get her to be a little bit more self-promoting. But I have to say, we're going to talk today about graphic novels and manga, but I'm guessing we might slip into some other conversations. She is a former school librarian, and she really heads up our school library program. And so that's another area we can talk about. And as well as for the past, is it 4 years, Karen, with the Library of Congress?
Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about what that is so I don't get it wrong?
Sure. So we have a grant. We're partnering with the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. And the grant is teaching civil rights through primary sources with the Library of Congress. And it all evolved after the tragic shooting in Charleston in 2015, and then we applied for the grant and got it. And we're in our 4th year. It's a 5-year grant with a possibility of 2 more years after that. We'll see, hopefully. And we just speak to educators, librarians, and teachers all over South Carolina, and frankly, all over the nation, because we present at a lot of conferences as part of this about civil rights available through the Library of Congress. And I just kind of had an aha moment last year and thought, well, primary sources are great visual resources. What if I bring graphic novels into it? So now the Dog and Pony show I do brings in teaching with primary sources and graphic novels on civil rights topics. And there are some great graphic novels out there. And if anybody wants that presentation, just email me individually and I can send that to you as well, because there's some good tie-ins with Library of Congress and graphic novels.
And it's a wonderful project. And and I hope I'm not going to give away later part of the presentation, but the one story that I'll tell to kick off is that Karen was involved very much in the creation of a graphic novel, which I know you're going to talk about, of AIDS in the End Zone. I believe I got that right. And it was kind of interesting to hear, oh wow, not only did you study it, but you helped work with some kids to produce one. Isn't that interesting? And then I swear it was 3 months into it before we had the conversation where it's like, oh, and by the way, these were incarcerated youth, and going into working with youth that really need every amount of support we can give is just the kind of, to me, representation of not only the great work she does, the impact that we all try to have in that research, but also, once again, the real caring and aspect of making sure that everyone learns and has a chance to move ahead and is empowered. So it's absolutely, I love my job. So I'll just leave it there. So I'm gonna shut up and I'm gonna listen because Karen's put together a great set of slides to begin with. So I'll just turn it over to you if that's all right.
That's great. And greetings, everyone. I'm not sure what your time zones are. It's morning here, but hope you're having a good day. Please type in questions in the chat, and I'll receive those as we go. But I'm just going to do an overview of some of the work I've done, and welcome any questions. So I would imagine that everyone in this session knows what a graphic novel is, but you know, when I present, I'm never quite sure. I still have some sort of skeptics, or what I call naysayers, but my favorite way to describe it is Will Eisner, and he says that a long comic book that would need a bookmark. The other thing I stress is that graphic novels are a format and not a genre. So that's important to know as well. And manga is a Japanese word for comic book. A lot of people mispronounce this, and the students will call you out on it if you do. It is manga, not manga. These were originally published in Japan. Read right to left, which is different for those of us who are Westerners. But I've seen amazingly popular, especially like middle schools now, they're even dropping manga down into lower grade levels as well. So these will run sometimes 35 deep in a series, and you can get a lot of readers who may be what I call illiterate, not as interested in reading but capable of it. But we've seen a lot of readers get hooked on these as well. And by the way, David mentioned I have school library background. I was also children's and youth services, so I'm hoping we've got some of those participants in the audience, or who will view the archives as well. A little trigger happy. So Mouse came out in 1992 by Art Spiegelman. If you haven't read it, it's amazing. It's really more of an adult graphic novel, but some high schools as well use it for some required reading. But it won the Pulitzer, and that was a game changer as far as giving credibility to graphic novels as literature. I've listed on the screen, and I'm not going to read them out, but some of the ones that have won in recent years for children and young adults. And you can see a variety of awards that have come out. So when I started teaching about graphic novels in 2010, I would have naysayers in the audience when I was speaking at conferences, those who said they weren't buying them, they were curious about them, but they didn't think they were real literature, that type. Now, with these awards and others, there's really seen a huge shift in that attitude. In fact, I was thrilled, as a lot of graphic novel fans were, in that this year in January at the American Library Association Midwinter meeting, it was announced that New Kid by Jerry Craft won the Newbery. It's the first time a book has ever won the Newbery. They've been honor books, but not the award itself. So that was an exciting award to learn about. And these are some of the others that won the award. One to call your attention to, if you're a Star Trek fan, is They Called Us Enemy, and by George Takei. I hope I'm not butchering his name. He was Takei. Thank you, David. And what was his character? Do you remember? He
was Sulu.
Star Trek. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Nice to have.
Oh, yeah, we're in my wheelhouse. Don't worry.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I'm going to give you this book if you haven't read it. So when he was a child, was taken away to a Japanese internment camp, and it's an amazing story. So that won an Asian Pacific American Award in the young adult category, and that one is truly a great social justice graphic novel, which I'll be dealing with that more in a few slides. And thanks for filling in, David. That one's not my wheelhouse. So you can see some other awards here, some LGBTQ, genderqueer, and some others that have won awards just this past January. So Stephen Krashen is a huge literacy guru. His name's probably familiar to a lot of you. And he's one of the first literacy researchers who really talked about comics and the value of comics. He says that there's, people say that or critics say it might be dumbed down literature, but he says the vocabulary is actually high. Very beneficial to English language learners and low-level readers, and then it can serve as a bridge to other literature. And also there have been studies in Canada and around the world. There's a big Canadian study about boys often choose graphic novels, and there's reasons why, and you can read some of those studies. The bridge to other literature is one that I saw in action. My dissertation was with boys who were in the 8th grade in a middle school, and they were and very, very low-level readers. I'd say they were reading about on a 3rd grade reading level. And I had a book club with them of graphic novels. And one of the boys was a big music fan, so I gave him a Bob Marley graphic novel. He took it home, he brought it back, and he said, "Do you think there are other books about Marley in the library?" Which just made my day. There's also stories of people reading. There's some excellent graphic novels, too, that come to mind on Anne Frank, and stories of young people reading that and then saying, "Now I'd like to read The Diary of Anne Frank," or Romeo and Juliet, and then wanting to read Shakespeare's version. So that's one of my favorite things about graphic novels, is the way they can get students interested in other texts as well. Art Spiegelman, who I mentioned, wrote Mouse, and I'm going to talk about him and his wife in a minute in another capacity, but he says they're a gateway drug to literacy, and I would agree after conducting this study with these boys. Even had an autistic child in the group, and later the teacher who allowed me to do this study with her students emailed me and said that he had become like the little graphic novel guru in their class. He just loved the graphic novels and would come back and tell the other students they should read this. It's in the library. So it really can open the door to literacy for some students who might be reticent or have some learning differences. I mentioned the English language learners, but it's also effective in language arts classes. Students with disabilities, there's a study about using graphic novels with deaf students and how they responded to it. I worked with the autistic child, and then there's some other studies as well. And then they really can support English language learners. As I tell when I was teaching undergrad and teaching this class on graphic novels, I would say, what if you were thrown into another country? So for an American being in a classroom in Russia or China where the language means nothing to you, and you were studying something, and you were able to have a book that had the visuals, and you could learn by associating the visuals with the text. So there's a lot of truth that it can really help people who learning languages from other countries. So I get asked a lot when I do presentations about what do I know, what's appropriate, what's good for my collection, what's not, how do you know? I would say treat it as you would any materials you purchase. Make sure, whether you're a public librarian or a school librarian, that you include these resources in your collection development plan so it's up to date. There's so many professional resources out there, and the PDF file that we've got here for you will give you a lot of those. In America, there's the American Library Services to Children and Adult Library Services Association that have established lists. Again, that information's I'll talk about a little bit more, and it's on your handout. A lot of librarians, whether they're public or school, have advisory committees and get the students involved. One of my favorite librarians who I wrote a book with her on connecting comics to curriculum, Mindy Tomasevich, she would put up a whiteboard in her library because she couldn't keep up with the manga series. So she would put up a whiteboard, and the kids that were on top of it would come in and, "We need number 24," and give the title, or they'd recommend what they wanted next. And the other is to get hands-on with the books as well. I used to just go plop down in the graphic novel section of my local bookstore and see, and also watch and see what the kids were getting. So the resources I mentioned, there's a great new roundtable within the last 3 to 5 years called the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. There's also a list that anyone can get on. It's the listserv GNLIB. It shows you how to subscribe, and that's active. I mentioned the list. If you look on the slide to the right, this is the latest one, the 2019, and there are more. I just did a screenshot and got a couple on there. And then one of my favorite things is that the comic book stores in the United States, anyway, have a first Saturday in May is Free Comic Book Day. You can go to that website and put in your zip code, and it'll tell you where the comic stores are giving away free books and where their locations are, and they will give them away to librarians and teachers entire set. So that's a great way to engage your patrons and students with comics and graphic novels. So this is a book by Scott McCloud, which is considered a seminal work, and it really explains how to read a graphic novel. Art teachers use this, and a lot of others as far as teaching young people how, and adults too, how to really read and interpret graphic novel panels and gutters and the use of colors and captions. I mentioned Art Spiegelman. If you're not aware of this site and you have young patrons, young students, young children of your own, this is an amazing site. I've been recommended it to a lot of my friends who have young kids during this time of schooling from home. It's called Toon Books, and it's Art Spiegelman, and his wife is Francois, and she is actually the New Yorker cartoon editor. And so they created this together. The neat thing about it is that the books are written in, I think it's 6 different languages, and so someone reads it aloud and the students click and advance the books. These are award-winning books, and they were smart. They know all the big illustrators in the field, so they talked a lot of them into illustrating the books. And as I said, they've won a ton of awards. So, you know, if you have a child who wants to learn Spanish, and you can have them read the book, and they can pace themselves on in English first and then see it in Spanish, or just enjoy them in whatever language they want to, but all free, all because that the Spiegelmans want to bring graphic novels down to the level of these early readers and these adorable, I think, easy to read Toon Books. So David mentioned AIDS in the End Zone, and this is one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. I worked with Dr. Kenda Albright, who was at University of South Carolina at the time, and now she's at State University. She did work on HIV/AIDS in Africa, and so she approached me about 2 weeks after I started at South Carolina and said, I think we could partner on research, and I had no idea where she was going with it. But she said in Africa, storytelling was the medium that was the most effective for communicating information about AIDS. And she had heard my presentation about graphic novels and said, I think for teens that graphic novels would be the format to go. So I was intrigued by the idea. We ended up going to the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice, Birchwood High School. There's a really dynamic teacher there, English language ELA teacher, and he worked with us, and we had 2 of his classes, which was really interesting, and so we had them back to back, different hours, and we worked with them over the period of about 6 weeks over the summer, and they developed the text. We did not. The only thing we changed is that the teacher, after the students left one day, told us we could not use the names they had suggested because they were gang names. But everything else was purely their storyline, and we wanted it to be, as we said, no teenagers are going to want to hear a storyline from middle-aged white women. So they ended up writing the story themselves, and then we were fortunate enough through grants to have an illustrator. The story was eventually published by Young Palmetto Press, which was at the time a division of the University of South Carolina Press. And then we did research with it. So we were convinced that if you compared this graphic novel, which Kendra, with critique filled with facts throughout, little pop-ups, next to on the sidebars, and we had a lot of references of resources at the end. So we compared that in studies in public libraries with patrons. We compared that with using the Center for Disease Control materials for teenagers on HIV/AIDS, and got great results with the graphic novels. The students retained the information better, and so that was, a really powerful project working together with her. So after that happened, we had success. We heard from the New York Times. There's a video about it on USA Today website still, and a lot of publicity from AIDS magazines and journals. Anyway, the Juvenile Justice contacted us because there was a major gang riot, sadly, at the school, and they had major gang issues. So they asked, would we come back and do one on gangs to create an anti-gang message and have the students work through those issues. Kendra had gone on to Kent State at the time, so I went out and worked with a wonderful librarian, Susan McNair, who had started the job since the last project, the AIDS in the End Zone project. So again, we were very fortunate, and I'll give a shout out. We received a Will Eisner grant that's available through the American Library Association that helped fund illustrators. We got 2 young illustrators from Benedict College, which is an historically black college, who had trained under Sanford Green, who was a famous illustrator. And so they came and helped us. I would encourage you, if those of you working with young kids and teens, to try to write graphic novels. It's my favorite thing is the line that they became creators, not just consumers of the information. They were so engaged, both in the AIDS in the End Zone project and in the gang-related project. One of them said, I'm an author now. They were interested in anything related to the topic. So when we did AIDS in the End Zone, the social studies teachers got them researching for social studies, the science teacher, the science of AIDS and HIV. And then, when our week ended, they were apparently begging their teachers, can we do a graphic novel on the Vietnam War? Can we do it on this? Can we do it on that? So they just loved it, and it was a great consensus builder for this group. And they had a previous class taught by the assistant principal on consensus skills, and we were amazed at that, how well they worked together. So the image you see on your screen is for the graphic novel, which they named Shootout, A Tale from the Streets, and it's their storyboarding with the help of their English language arts teacher. So they storyboarded, and they did each page, and then they described it. We had them create the text in both situations, but before the illustrators came in, and they wrote their own dialogue. There's a great book, if you're interested in doing this, on the screen from Compass Point. So this is, we actually had them, the librarian and the ELA teacher had them go to their rooms, and their at the facility, and come up with this separate from each other, and that's how they got started on their characters. And you can see the different things that they had for their characters and what their mannerisms were and their strengths and their past, and then we brought all these characters together, and then they started storyboarding them. One of the most powerful days is when we brought in the 2 illustrators, because these were young African American males, and most of our students were African Americans. And the young man with the toboggan on the left was the illustrator who he actually lived in the projects where some of these boys were, and he told them his story, and they were like, man, you came from such and such, and look what you're doing now. And so that was really powerful. But I showed the sketchbook. The other illustrator who's next to him in the sort of the burgundy shirt, as these boys talked, he just, I couldn't figure out he was doing. He just sat there and sketched what you see on the screen just in the process of 10 minutes while they were saying what they wanted the character to look like. So it was really inspiring to see them work together. Now you're probably thinking, well, I don't have the money for an illustrator. So we went to the kids themselves and said, we're going to talk to librarians and teachers about this. What would you tell them when they want to replicate the project? And they said, oh man, you don't have to have an illustrator, just let a kid do it. They can even do stick figures. So they just were so sold on it. They realized that not everybody would be able to have an illustrator, but they said, you know, have them do it anyway, or have an art student come and work with them. So this is Shoot Out, A Tale from the Streets, after the processes that I mentioned to you. And then I've created a slide, which I won't walk through totally, but for future reference, it tells you how you could replicate it. And again, maybe collaborate with an art teacher, or if you know an illustrator in the area who's willing to give their times. But it was amazing. I could over and over again, just the idea of letting them create their own graphic novels. The other side of that was, with the Will Eisner grant, the librarian also got about $3,000 worth of graphic novels for the collection. And once these guys got turned on to creating them, she said she couldn't keep the books on the shelves. So it was sort of a win-win for reading and creating. And now I'll move on to the current project that I'm doing. I'm working with a professor in Australia at Charles Sturt University. Her name is Casey Garrison. And we received funding through several grants. One of them was a Carnegie Whitney grant. And what we're doing is studying social justice graphic novels. We really believe that you can teach social justice issues very effectively through graphic novels, because they can see the diversity of the characters, and it's just a great way to support global citizenship. So the art and the text make it just a really effective tool for teaching social justice topics. We've been working on this for about a year, and I had the great pleasure of being able to go to Australia with some funding, and then Casey came back over to the United States, and we visited over 8 libraries, 4 in each country, some major children's libraries in Australia. We were able to do research at the Library of Congress, which has always been on my bucket list, and had a great time researching these. You can see on the screen some of the ones we came up with, and that's Casey's name. I wanted to give a shout out to her. So, you know, the topics range from I Am Alfonso is Black Lives Matter. Hey Kiddo is an amazing book, and the author, his parents, his mother was an alcoholic and addict, and he grew up with his grandparents, and sketching and drawing saved his life, and now he's an amazing award-winning author. I've already mentioned They Called Us Enemy. To the left, Unwanted, and then to the far right, Escaping Wars and Waves is about Syrian refugees. The Arrival, Immigration. Inside Out, Eating Disorders. Yummy, Gang Life. Wild Ocean, Climate Change. John Muir, Climate Change. Spinning, LGBTQ, Lighter Than My Shadow. Eating Disorders, and then several others on the screen. I won't go through all of them, but email me if you'd like, you know, to know some more of the ones that we're creating. So we just had an article published in The Conversation, which is not a research journal. It's more on layman's level, and it's actually professors. If you're not familiar with this, I love this site and get it daily. It's The Conversation, and it's from all over the world, actually. It's very big in Australia. I know, because Casey was excited for us to be published in it. And we just created, just recently, an article. We also have a project website that's going to be available in the summer, and you can see that URL on the screen. Right now it just has an under construction sign on it, but check back maybe June. And we're going to list the topics that I just mentioned and the different categories I just mentioned, but we're also provide resources for librarians and teachers. There's studies that have shown that a lot of educators know the power, it's undeniable, the power of the circulation and popularity of graphic novels. That's not deniable, but they just aren't comfortable with how to use them. As one librarian said to me, I'm happy to buy them, I use the list, but I don't read graphic novels. I would argue she should try to discover what her students or patrons enjoy, but there is that reticence to teach the unknown. So this website is designed, it is high school level, but it is designed to help librarians and educators know how. We've got, you know, we're using ones that are already out there on the internet. Yummy, for example, has been out a while, and there's some excellent lesson plans about that. And then we're also developing some and adding to them. So it's going to be the resources themselves and then how they can be used. So we hope you'll come back and take a look at that website when you get a chance. So, as I said, it's no longer if, which it was if when I first started talking about graphic novels, but how to use them. There are a lot of studies showing how they can make the curriculum more relevant for students. If you're a school librarian or, you know, as a children's youth services librarian, when students come to you for help with homework, don't forget that it's some excellent nonfiction and graphic novels that can be used for these reports as well. And it's just, I think, time for librarians to think about how we can make these lessons more relevant, both academically, recreationally, for our students. And you know, one of the things that I do hear, I talk about the naysayers and the yay-sayers, far more yay-sayers now than there were when I started, but I do have the occasional, my principal doesn't want me buying them for the library, or parents coming into a public library and saying, Sally, my daughter can check out anything but a graphic novel. And I'll just give you a little anecdotal story of, I had someone in one of my sessions, someone brought that up, said the principal resisted, and the woman in the audience said, mine did too, and then I gave him a copy of Mouse, told him to go home and read it, and he came back and said, changed my mind, this is amazing. So sometimes just you know, actually putting in their hands a very powerful graphic novel can make them rethink their biases against it. There are also a ton of research studies out there now, and so the ability to share the data, the research that's come in, is another way to inform them. So I wanted to allow time, and I'm so tickled with this picture on the screen. The illustrator that I mentioned that we used for Aids in the End Zone, for the book, she did these illustrations of us, and I love it. I was a lot younger then, obviously, but anyway, it's fun to have that. So I'm just going to open it up for questions and fire away, and if you think of any later, and you can just email me. You see my email on the screen, but happy to take any questions about what I've discussed.
All right, I'm going to stop the sharing of the slides for just a moment.
Sure.
So, and as people are formulating, I got questions, so I'm going to jump.
Fire away.
Well, a lot of them, you know, I write them down, you answer them, so thanks for that. But actually, I'll start with the obvious. The what I call the pizza book problem, and that is that all these libraries, I hear them all the time. It's like, well, we have pizza and we have all these great sessions, and they sort of don't count unless there's a book involved at the end. In other words, you know, we get great authors to come in, or we have magicians or programming and youth services, etc. But obviously, it doesn't matter unless there's an uptick in book checkouts.
Sure.
I put that sort of in a similar way, which is the idea of, you know, giving something that you consider not as valuable to try and get people in. And a phrase that you used, and I just want, because I know where we're headed, but you talked about the gateway drug to literacy. What I'm also hearing, though, is that these graphic novels are not just gateway drugs. They're not just oh, we'll get them in the library and we'll get them used to reading, and then we'll give them the real stuff. This is
Right,
the real
right.
stuff.
It is. It is. And I'm so glad you raised that. There's a wonderful story. I cannot track the article down, which frustrates me immensely. But there's a wonderful story about an English language arts teacher who taught Beowulf for years. And she read, Gareth Hines does amazing. All of his things are classic literature, and he does amazing full text. I mean, he's not, doing the annotated text or anything. And so she wanted to purchase it for her students because she thought it would make a real difference in their interest level. The principal wouldn't give her the money, and like a lot of great educators we know, she bought it out of pocket. And she wrote about coming in after she had given them their first assigned reading, the first number of chapters, and saying, it was like the first period of the day when we know half the students are in a coma, and she said she couldn't believe it. She walked in and they were walking around showing pictures and talking about it. Their comprehension on the test was far better, and so sold. I have a pet peeve about people saying, and I did say, I did it with slow readers that really had major reading issues, but I argue strongly that these are for AP readers. If you talk to authors, some of the best authors out there will say they read comics, and that's what got them into reading. But AP teachers are doing amazing work with graphic novels as well. It's not just eye candy or, like you're saying, just to get them in the door to read, a few silly books. It's great stuff.
So if I could just build on that for a moment, as someone interested in literacy and literacy programs in general. So the notion, it's okay to read Marvel comic books, right? I mean,
Sure.
right? So, I mean, because clearly when you're talking to principals, when you're trying to convince people about curriculum, something like Mouse, something like
Yeah.
these really strong graphic novels are really easy for them to connect to. Oh, that's a serious topic that graphic novels can address. But when you talk about manga, when we begin that, when you talk about just getting people interested, I mean, that's literacy. Just reading is reading is reading.
Yeah.
Is that a
Yeah.
fair comment?
It's very fair. If you read Stephen Krashen, he says reading cereal boxes is reading. Seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
think of kids, scooping their cereal up and just eyes entranced on a cereal box because all the stuff on the back. So yeah, as long as they're reading, then and there's just it's been mind blowing how many great nonfiction topics there are in graphic novels now. As I mentioned, the autistic boy that I mentioned loved dinosaurs, and there's an amazing series of dinosaur books. And I made the mistake of telling him, well, it's a series and they'll be coming out with more. And so every time he called me Miss G, and every time I came in, I mean, I'd be there twice a week. Miss G, has the new one come out yet? Has the new one come out yet? But yeah, there's just some great ways for these students to learn and get engaged in ways that previously they were illiterate readers. So.
I have a colleague who was very much into gaming and was also making the same connection, which is that a lot of Pokemon games on the Nintendo DS and all these different platforms have a lot of reading involved.
Yeah.
The idea of, some of them are obviously, first person and all these, but a lot of them are you go in, you connect to someone, you're talking back and forth, and you're reading. So the other thing that I'm interested in is I see a lot of the literature around literacy and literature around reading. Even audiobooks are sort of triggering the same brain functions, the same decoding functions, the same tracking narrative functions.
Yeah, that's another format that's been great. John Shiska, who wrote the True Story of the Three Little Pigs, he's full in on audiobooks, and again, for boys. He's got boys. He's got a website totally dedicated to this, and he speaks a lot about audiobooks and how it can sometimes reach students that it might not otherwise reach. The interesting thing about audiobooks and ebooks is that they're finding that some students like the fact that they're hidden. It may be that it's a student who is a student who is questioning their sexual identity and is interested in reading some books about that, but doesn't want anyone else to see them. So they may, get an audiobook or an ebook for that topic as well. So that was something I read about that hadn't occurred to me. But yeah, that format as well. Any way we can get kids reading, anyway, I think I support. Just a side on your Pokemon is that one of the guys in my reading club, there were 6 boys, and one of them, very reluctant reader, the teacher had told me before I got him, and I had Pokemon graphic novels, and he was a gamer and just ripped through those, didn't know they were available, and then he saw one on the Titanic that struck his fancy, and then he said, can we get our teachers to teach these books instead of the textbooks? And I said, take it to them and ask, So anyway, so that Pokemon, that was funny that you brought that out because I had the experience with the kid.
Sarah mentions visual novels are a genre of video games. So actually, there's a really interesting combination within it. Have you heard of the audio graphic novels?
No.
Yeah, I heard this at the last midwinter.
No.
I heard this and it took me a moment.
Yeah, I'm doing the same thing.
But really, it's the idea that obviously it's an audiobook and uses the text portion of it, but a lot of it is sort of, now this is an old phrase, the radio play notion, which is it's not just reading the text, it's also sound effects and other kinds of things that are really taking the story and making them available.
No.
Yeah, so something.
I hadn't heard about that. That's interesting.
New genre of the day. I really someday, I keep telling myself my next book is going to be a graphic novel. I'm intimidated, and this is from someone who started college as an illustration major, but the illustration part is what stops me. The idea that it's like, okay, I could probably come up with the story and the writing. But who's going to want to see my drawings, or who's going to get that art? And so I was very taken with your comment about, it could be stick figures. It can be, it's not just, it's transforming, getting people to read, getting people literacy skills, and then including the literacy, the writing, translation over to writing and creation side of things. Yes,
exactly. One side impact from that Eisner grant was that that facility, so many of those kids were active in gangs. In fact, we tiptoed around it when we went in and just said, you may have known someone in your high schools that were in gangs, and they just flat out said, we didn't want to assume it, but and so we did a little thing where they identified the strong art students, and then those 2 illustrators worked with them for 3 hours one day. We gave them lunch. They brought in lunch, and they created posters with anti-gang messages. And it was fascinating to see their art develop under the training of these young men who they could totally relate to. And then we had them in the family center and got a lot of great reception. It's very powerful. But all of them said it doesn't matter. Our illustrator was named Sarah, the first one. And they said, you don't have to have a Sarah. Just let somebody who likes to draw do it. Who cares? The whole point is working together on it. It was powerful hearing that from them.
Yeah, and I'm very struck by the idea, and so turning for a moment to what libraries can take out of this experience. And one of the phrases that I think we hear a lot increasingly these days in a good way is the idea of the library as a publisher of the community. That is, that it's not just a place to come and get and consume and et cetera, but it's a place to create and produce. And,
exactly.
And I'm thinking what what I heard that was very impressive was that, one, graphic novels can be a gateway to production and not just, consumption.
Mhm.
That people
Mhm.
might be intimidated by the idea of, how do I write, a 400-page book, and will I have that much to
Right.
say, and all that, as opposed to, I can work about this in sort of manageable
Mhm.
chunks that I can work on a
Uh-huh.
sort of frame by frame basis. Can you talk
Yeah.
a little bit
Yeah.
about the idea, or what you may have heard of, whether it's in graphic novels or other contexts, where youth librarians in public settings or school librarians are really working to promote the library as a sort of publisher?
That's an interesting question. I do know a lot of libraries have anime clubs and are getting students in, and then doing a lot of I know Robin Brennan is a friend of mine, and she's a youth services librarian in Massachusetts. She's published some books and a lot of articles, and she's done some really creative things as far as the Asian culture of having them, come in for anime clubs or graphic novels clubs, and creating whether it's different foods or arts and crafts, that type of thing, as part of their sessions. So she does a lot with that. She's an amazing librarian. Um, you know, Everyone's doing maker spaces, whether it's schools or public libraries, and I would argue this would be an interesting maker space offshoot. To get a group. I know a lot of the maker spaces in the schools they're doing because of lack of time, maybe doing it at lunch or after school, some of the things. And so they could, get kids together and maybe have the art teacher and an ELA teacher combine, to pull in different students with different skills and work together. I mean, seriously, Kendra and I had a lot of trepidation about working with two different classes of incarcerated youth. It's a little intimidating to be in there with someone with a gun in the corner while you're working with the students as security guards and everything. But I was absolutely floored at how well they worked together and how they reached consensus. And we finally said something to the ELA teacher about, my goodness, you couldn't get this kind of behavior in a model setting. I mean, these students, they told us stories of them, fighting and issues like that. And he said that the assistant principal had done consensus building, and so they were it was amazing. And so just you think of that variety of kids and backgrounds, and how powerful it could be to combine some art students with some, students who love to write, and combine them in different ways in a makerspace environment kind of thing, whether it be public or school.
Well, and I'm thinking beyond the kids, we have a lot of public libraries are supporting writing groups and aspiring
Oh
writers.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure though. I've heard of, and so let's put this out to the world, about libraries having graphic novel clubs, about
Uh-huh.
having not just reading but producing,
Yeah,
getting together, sharing techniques and questions, and reviewing each other's works, and gathering
right.
around that means of production.
And I hadn't thought about that. You could get an adult writing club to perhaps mentor, younger writers and bring in illustrators. And there are lots of grants out there where you could, bring in different professionals to help in these ways too. So.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned a few different techniques. I'm looking at the time, but I want to
Mhm.
talk a little bit about overcoming resistance. So you had mentioned the
Yeah,
idea of, for principals, but also I imagine for teachers and librarians, and collecting them. So
yeah,
one is showing them mouse and showing them sort of really directly effective curricular tools, if you will, right?
yeah,
Are
yeah.
there what kind of resistance do you run into, and how do you overcome it?
In the beginning, as I said, I was starting to talk about this in 2010. And in the beginning, actually some resistance from librarians themselves. I can remember, I think it was an ALA conference, and a woman came in, and um, I had a big group, and then I was packing up, and she came up to me and said, well, this was interesting. She said, but I don't like graphic novels, and I don't buy them for my collections. I just wanted to hear what you had to say. I've used that in my own classes to tell students that in the example that one of my students told me that she inherited a school library collection that had 100 cookbooks, and that he said, what's going on, to another faculty member, and they said, oh, Mrs. Jones was a gourmet chef, so she bought cookbooks. And so I use that with my students to say it is not about you and what you enjoy. If you're a big fantasy fan, don't overload your collection with fantasy. Find out what the kids want. It's so important to know. When I was a middle school librarian, Goosebumps was the rage. Now Goosebumps is a graphic novel, which just it pleases me immensely. That even Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, which I cut my teeth on, are graphic novels. But I took home 3 Goosebumps and read them, and then came back and said the names of the characters, and they were like, "You read Goosebumps, Miss Gavin?" It's I tell the librarians, just because you don't like them it's not you're
about you.
Yeah, it's not about you. So that kind of helped. The other is I love the mouse story. Just love that story, and that's effective. But also the research, and I'm not saying plop a big study on someone's desk or a dissertation, but just when you go to presentations and get those bullet points of how it impacts students. And there are more and more studies coming out. When I started, there were not very many. 0 school librarians doing it. It was mostly academic and public librarians doing research in it. But there are a ton of studies, and you can sort of encapsulate them and do some talking points and prove it. But honestly, the study that I did that was the most powerful was the circulation study. I did it 4 schools in North Carolina, 4 in South Carolina, middle schools. And the percentages of what the graphic novel collection would be a range of, say, 5 to 12% of the collection. The circulation of that collection versus the entire collection was amazing. Like one librarian, it was 29% of the circulation compared to all of the other Dewey areas. So there are more and more circulation studies. So, that by itself, this is what the kids want. Don't stand between them and what they want. And, just because it's not your choice of reading.
Right. When I was in Oslo, we visited a branch library, and it had 2 floors. The top floor was a dedicated children's area with collections and activities and such. And the bottom was cut into 2. Both of them had stages. It was very much, they really modeled it as a coffee house. It was in a gentrifying neighborhood, which meant that people had great, really expensive apartments with not a lot of room, so they needed a physical space to go hang out with. To go back to normalcy. Anyway, but half of their collection, not quite, but pretty close to half of their collection were graphic novels.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is not only did they have a large portion of graphic novels, every year they would hold a comic convention, a graphic novel convention. They would, in essence, close down the library for this conference, had people coming in, had authors, had creators. So it was a matter of taking an interest the community had and turning it really into a larger community engagement impact. And that was very impressive to me.
That's going on. When I was in Sweden, I had the exact same experience. I was thrilled. They took up the whole first floor of the library with these graphic illustrators and writers, and it was packed. Little kids, elderly. It was all ages, and there are lots of Comic-Cons going on in public libraries now. There's, I think, either Greenville or Anderson, there's a very successful one. They said they were blown away the first year with the number of people, and now they've had to bring in, allowing for extra parking and everything. Hugely popular. So yeah, I see a lot of that going on, and I love it. It's exciting.
Yeah, Sarah from one of our audience just mentioned the fact that a lot of public libraries are having mini Comic Cons
Yes.
and bring them in.
Yeah.
Can you talk? Have you looked at all or have thoughts about particularly? I think at some point I'm going to get this tattooed on my forehead. But in trying times like these,
Mhm,
but the
mhm.
use of digital graphic novels as a digital platform. I'm thinking, for example, of Hoopla. A lot of libraries.
Uh-huh.
And Hoopla has actually a pretty good and extensive collection of graphic novels available through digital platforms.
Right. You know, I'm glad you brought that up. That was in my slide, and I cut it out. I was worried we didn't have time. But digital comics are very popular. A lot of people don't realize that American Born Chinese by Jean Yang actually started out as a digital comic. There are a lot of examples of that, of where it was just sort of a comic being contributed to, and then publishers got wind of it and published it. But also public libraries are subscribing more so than schools, from what I'm hearing anecdotally, but are subscribing, and I'd love if anybody is in their library chime in, digital comics. You know, it's like ebooks. You're kind of navigating. I just did an ebook webinar, and it's just interesting how schools and public librarians are navigating through ebook issues, and publishers themselves. You know, with availability and platforms and equitable access for patrons and students. But yeah, the digital world is alive and strong with comics and digital publishers who are, you know, getting public libraries on board with it as well.
One of the conversations that I'm always taken by the Economist, and I apologize, the Stanford Economist comment about a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And a lot of what we're doing these sessions is to not necessarily be what do we do right now when we're at
Yeah,
home, but
yeah,
what do we do when we open the doors back up? But
right.
what I'm really curious about is I think that when we talk about the library as publisher, when we talk about the library as facilitating creation, whether it's in
Uh-huh.
graphic novels and great resource to do it, when we look at the online environment, it's almost back 100% to consumption, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
come into our library and you can use the makerspace.
Mhm.
Come into the
Mhm.
library and we can have a writers discussion group. Come into the library and we can have a session, what have you.
Mhm.
But now we've sent people home, and our answer is, well, go to Hoopla and you can download some books. Go to
Yeah,
Overdrive and you can
yeah,
download some books.
yeah,
And it would be really interesting to think about what does the creation aspect of a library online look like. I know that there are
yeah,
online tools to actually produce comics
yeah,
and
yeah.
graphic novels.
Read, Write, Think has a great one. Make Believe Comics. There's several. I've got a list. Again, that's a slide I didn't include because of lack of time. Anybody wants to email me, I've got a list of them that are readily available for free for students to use, and teachers are using them in very innovative ways. And parents could too at home just to get them started. One of them for a comic strip is to teach some, task, some chore like making brownies or, something like that, or a scientifically minded person could, create something. And so it's a real way to engage them. And then they just pull in. They don't have to be an illustrator. They can pull in the little emoticons and figures and drag and plop and play. So there's some great stuff out there, really great, that teachers are enjoying using.
Very good. Any final words? Final thoughts?
No, I'm telling you that it's been wonderful watching how much they've exploded and how now they're being accepted and embraced, and I love it, and I hope that continues. And it's been an extremely rewarding for me to see this evolve and to work in the ways I have. And thank you to those who came, and if you have questions, email me. David, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to see your mug. It's been too long. And best wishes to all of you, and happy reading during this
Thank you.
stressful time.
Yes, thanks again. And once again, hopefully by the end of today, we'll have this up with the slides and a set of resources that were provided. Thank you for that. And I hope to see you all on Thursday, where Valerie Birdfort and I are going to be talking about story time, engaging youth in now and in the future. And I thank everyone for their time. Stay safe and wash your hands.